Amused by the story. Maybe it's not really true, but I heard a story once about the J.N. Andrews sculpture at Andrews, and that there was some fairly clever students that sacrificed a can of fried chick in front of it was your friend? So the story is true. I love it. Anyway, but again, how did we get so comfortable with art and depicting not just fish and birds, but even divine figures, like of Christ? So that is our question for this evening. And to try to answer that question, we're going to go all the way back to the earliest days of the Christian church, and sort of follow this thread through until, we're not even getting all the way to Martin Luther. We'll just make brief references to Protestant problems with art. But we're going to start with the earliest forms. And as I said, by the end of this seminar series, we're going to be talking about much more contemporary art. But let's start at the beginning. So we have to start by thinking about the fact that the early Christian church is growing out of a Jewish community, and the Jewish community takes the commandment seriously. There was no representational art in Jewish culture, and there still isn't much representational art in Jewish culture because they do read the commandment, as we just discussed. But we do have early Christians who were once Jews, and they're all still working, many of them in workshops, in the Roman workshops, right? Developing, crafting for the Roman Empire, and they become very, very comfortable with traditional images that can easily be transposed into Christian stories, right? Take, for example, this image. It's a mosaic pavement of fishing. It's from Roman Syria, 2nd, 3rd century, but it's not a very big stretch to turn this into fishers of men and not just general Roman fishermen, right? Same thing with grapes, right? Grapes are everywhere in the Roman Empire, representing the god Bacchus, right? I mean, this is a very, very, very common image. But as early Christians are beginning to be persecuted, they're needing their own secret code language, right? And it turns out that it's very easy to turn this bunch of grapes into I am the vine and you are the branches, right? So we have evidence that as the Christians are being persecuted, that they are able to use some of this very common imagery from the time, Roman secular imagery, to be able to speak basically to each other and sort of have a sort of coded message. Go to Hermes. There's all kinds of images of shepherds. The pastoral tradition was strong in Rome. Seems like anytime you have an urban civilization, we start to be nostalgic for the pastoral, right? So there's lots of pastoral poetry, lots of talk about shepherds. Hermes is always thought of as the god who is a shepherd. So again, there's not a very big gap between this archaic Greek calf bearer in this case, but you can also see it in Rome, versus this other good shepherd that comes later, and then eventually many, many, many images, some of them painted onto the walls of catacombs that represent shepherds. But you can fairly easily deflect, oh, no, this isn't an image of Christ. It could just be another shepherd. So that's part of this story at the very beginning. So again, here is an image from one of those catacombs where you can see this sort of representational art is taking place early in the church, before they've had much time to sit around and think about the theology and the implications of the second commandment. That again was the centerpiece, so you can see it a little bit better in that catacomb. So that explains what's going on when the church is being persecuted, which means it doesn't take long at all to get from this humble shepherd figure to this, right? Christ, the Good Shepherd, in royal robes, emblazoned into the apses of churches once Christianity becomes in power. So that starts to become a more complicated story, right? Because here it is that we've had an empire that has absolutely mastered the art of propaganda, right? Using images, sculpture, painting, using it for propaganda purposes. And it seems that the early Christian church had learned that lesson fairly fairly well, too. So there's a very interesting book by Thomas Matthews on what he refers to as this emperor mystique, how the Christ figure sort of slips into the imagery that had once been the Roman emperor. He says, because the impoverished art of the catacombs and cemeteries was inadequate to express the grand claims the Christians were making for their God, they now appropriated the grandest imagery they could lay hands on, namely that which had been developed in the service of imperial propaganda. Finding themselves with an emperor of their own faith, Christians boldly appropriated for their own religious purposes the entire vocabulary of imperial art. So I love this next quote. He says, "The lanky good shepherd of early Christian art wrestled with the muscular Hercules and won." So, thus, we have imperial art. At the point when Christian art graduated from its closed private existence, before the Edict of Milan, which of course legalized Christianity at that point, 325, to a more public existence, right? It comes out from sort of its hidden spaces, then emblazoned on the apses and across the facades of churches. It suddenly became necessary to be able to imagine Christ. What does he look like? It mattered to the Romans what each of their emperors looked like. Just very, very briefly, in the Greek tradition of art, you hardly can ever know who you're looking at. I don't have any of those images here, but a Greek god and a Greek athlete basically all look the same. They have the same perfect physique, perfectly placid look on their face, right? It's all about the ideal, not about who the individual is. You would never see somebody with wrinkles or somebody who is slightly the wrong height in a Greek, in Greek sculpture. The Roman tradition loved veristic portraiture. They loved to have in their homes the bust of the paternal figure, and they were recognizable. They had jowls and they had wrinkles, and they were real people. So we can recognize the Roman emperors also in their images. We know who each one is. So in that context, it seemed extra important to be able to also depict Christ as a figure who's identifiable. Now, this process takes a little while. One really interesting example is this sarcophagus, or burial sort of casket, of Junius Bassus. This is around 359, which would be just a couple of decades after Christianity became legalized, right? It's not become the empire yet. But here is a really interesting bunch of sort of low relief carvings where you see different scenes, right, from both the Old Testament and the New. On the bottom, you can see, Adam and Eve. You can see right in the middle on the bottom the triumphal entry of Christ. But then if we drill in a little bit closer, which still might be a little bit hard to see, in the upper quadrant, we have Christ enthroned. He's a little bit hard to recognize because he is beardless. This is a Christ who looks for all the world like a Roman imperial figure, right? Sitting on a throne with his feet, very conveniently, plopped on top of what we understand is the head of Zeus. So this is a takeover, right? But this is Christ as an imperial figure, basically, now standing on top of those Roman gods. So another interesting way to think about this transition is to look at the fact that we also have a tradition of portraiture. This one, the one on your left, happens to be an Egyptian encaustic painting. Again, it's just an Egyptian person, right? Somebody of some nobility in class, enough to have a portrait painted. If you glance at it without pause, you might recognize that laurel wreath around his head, but mistake it as a crown of thorns and sort of, right? Because when you see that image of Christ that is next to it, you can see that they are drawing on traditions that were very much already in place in the secular world. So that kind of imagery of Christ, as I've been arguing, turns into, you've got those images of Caesar that were so well known at the time, but the images of Christ become Christ Pantocrator. That traditional image of Christ enthroned, Christ as ruler of all. And this is what's going to begin to move us toward the tradition of the use of icons, right, in the Christian tradition. But as you can see, it begins more as a political move than as a religious move, right? Politically asserting the power of the new authority of the Roman Empire. So we need to pause here and get some definitions. Since you've come to English class, we have to do some definitional work. So what is an icon? Well, according to this definition, any divine representation in any medium, so it could be painted, it can be carved, right, any sort of art form. It could be on cloth, wood, parchment, right? But if you look at the Greek, it is the truthful representation of an existing thing. Now, there's nothing spiritual about that definition, right? Except that word divine. So we are depicting something that has some form of divinity. But there is a great deal of emphasis here on the fact that it is a real thing, because you will notice they are having to distinguish that from those idols. So clearly we've got the second commandment in mind as we're going here. An idol, of course, is an image that is worshipped, which we would never do with an icon. A statue, a symbol of a false god. So this is how we are parsing the difference. We can depict images of our God because he's real, unlike those other silly people who have images of false gods that they worship. So again, in the Greek, a false representation of something that does not exist. So this is the terminology that the early Christians are thinking about and using as they move into a real tradition of the use of icons. So I'm using as my primary example here one of the earliest examples of an icon that we still have access to. As you're going to hear, we're going to go through an iconoclastic period where we're going to reject the use of icons, which means running around destroying most of them. So most of the early icons from this period were not preserved. This one happened to be out at a monastery on Sinai, and so it was nice and dry and safe, and nobody destroyed this one. So it is utilized a lot. And it's just interesting to pause for a moment and think about what these images entail. Because as you probably know, if you've spent any time with icons or thinking about icons, it doesn't matter when the icon is painted or who's painting it, they basically all look alike. Because the whole, genre is the wrong word, but this art form is not about the artist. The art form is about drawing you into contemplation of the divine. And so you're supposed to sort of strip it of anything that would be distracting. So they're all using this same basic tradition. So in this particular case, and I can read from many different art historians that are going to talk about sort of what we see in an icon, but they all tend to have the same tradition of, the eyes that are sort of almost boring into your soul, right? Because you're supposed to sort of be looking into the divine as you gaze at an icon. A high and noble forehead, which is supposed to represent the seat of wisdom. You have usually a fairly long, narrow, sort of noble Roman nose attached. This one scholar says that the mouth is always closed, because in the world of glory, all is vision and silence, which is interesting. But most importantly, the icons are going to be in a tradition where the background is always going to just be gold. right? Even these other ones that I showed you, it's just gold. So we're not talking about realism. It's not that earlier Greeks and Romans hadn't started to think about things like perspective and realism. But the idea is that you are being drawn into the heavenly space, the golden space, right? And so again, we're not being distracted by human things. As this scholar says, gold is not a color, it is brilliance, it is light, right? And it's radiating from the image toward the beholder. Matthews Green, who I was reading from before, he says that things in the background are getting larger as they go back. You can't necessarily see that in those images because there's not much in these backgrounds. And smaller as they come before you or towards you, which means the convergence point is in front of the picture, right where the viewer is standing. In other words, you become the vanishing point. And from that perspective of heaven, we are small. And if God did not sustain us, we would vanish. Now, again, that's just one scholar's interpretation of what's going on in these icons. But what we do know is that icons quickly become part of worship, an important part, not necessarily always of the public worship tradition, but they become part of private worship. And as you're going to see in this story, they especially take hold with women. Worshiping in their homes, because women would not have had necessarily a large role in the churches, and it's the women who tended to preserve and utilize these icons. And in addition, we also have record that fairly early, worshipers began to ascribe miraculous powers to these icons. And now we're getting into that really fuzzy business where are you beginning to worship the icon, or are you using the icon to help you worship? That's what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to help draw you into a contemplative space and contemplation of the divine. But they began to there's records of them scraping the paint from these icons off into drink and drinking it in hope of healing, right? So this became a really dominant force. And we have record of discomfort with this from early on, as you might imagine. Not everybody's going to think that that's a great idea. A bishop, Eusebius, for example, chastised the sister of Constantine. So remember, Constantine is the emperor who, whether or not he actually converted is under debate, but he was the emperor to at least legalize Christianity and maybe sort of kind of convert on his deathbed, but we don't really know that. So it's his sister. So we're talking the early days, before the church is really formalized. He chastises that sister for requesting an icon. But when the woman, and now I'm quoting, brought him an icon of Paul and Christ, clad as philosophers, interesting, he did not destroy the work, but confiscated it and kept it in his own house to prevent its improper use by women, which is hilarious. But again, he keeps the thing. Who knows what he does with the thing? But that worry that women cannot be trusted with icons because they ascribe too much power to those images. We also have people from the early church who are advocating for icons. Now, this one's quite a bit later. This quote is from the 8th century. This is John of Damascus, who says, "If you speak of pagan abuses, these abuses do not make our veneration of images loathsome. Blame the pagans who make images idols into gods. That's their own silly fault. That doesn't mean that's what we're doing with them. Just because the pagans use them in a foul way, that is no reason to object to our pious practice. Pagans make images of demons, which they address as gods, but we make images of God incarnate and of his servants and friends, and with them we drive away the demonic host." So you can see there's a wide range of opinions about the function of these images. So I'm going to give you just the briefest of reminders about the early church councils. We'll pause for a little history lesson here to orient you to the council that takes place, the Second Council of Nicaea, which is all about icon use. So you'll recall that the early church councils are just basically like early general conference sessions where you get together and you hammer out the most important theological points. And the earliest of those councils are all about the nature of Christ, right? Is he human? Is he divine? Is he both, right? And as you'll recall, we've got various, what become known as heresies, with people like Arius who are arguing that he is fully human and not divine. So you got to call a church council, you got to have a GC session to work that out. So it's from that first council of Nicaea that we get the Nicene Creed, which is often recited in Christian churches even to this day, that defines against Arius the true divinity of the Son of God. And it also fixes the date for Easter, so that's nice. But this is where we get that language of Christ being begotten and not made, if anybody's ever figured out what that actually means, that he's one with the Father, but not one with the Father, right? It's all that confusion about is there a Trinity or is there just one? So they're working that out at the First Council of Nicaea. The Second Council of Nicaea, they're still fussing about this, but they are now bringing in the Holy Ghost, so the Nicene Creed gets a little bit longer. In 431 in Ephesus, they're still talking about defining the personal unity of Christ. And in Chalcedon, the two natures of Christ, divine or human. And again, just as a reminder, this is where these councils are taking place. It is mostly, I'm going to skip over that one. Here's a better map. You'll notice that these are not happening in Rome at all. Right? Rome is not the center of power. The center of power is in the east, Constantinople, right? Byzantium, what is now Istanbul. So you can see that these councils are happening toward the east, and that is notable because there will become some strong tensions between how the Eastern Orthodox Church treats icons and how the Western Church treats icons. And that's partly because these conversations are going to be happening in the East. So, to continue our very, very brief flyby of these councils, in the final four councils, you'll see what I've got highlighted in red in 787 is the Second Council of Nicaea. And instead of spending all their time talking about the nature of Christ, this one is actually about, can we have holy images? This is the topic. But it turns out it is not unrelated to the previous question, because this is how the theology went down. If you believe that Christ is at least part human, you can paint that part, according to their logic. You can visualize somebody who lived on earth and was human. If you believe he's fully divine, then you better not be painting him, right? And this is why, even to this day, we don't see many images of God, right? Because we have not seen God, but we have seen Christ. And so they felt like it was important to be able to identify him, make him visible. So this takes us to a really, I think, somewhat amusing and interesting sequence of events that all center around the Second Council of Nicaea. You might be wondering why an English professor who specializes in 19th century British literature has any knowledge about this, which you should be skeptical of. I talk about this with my students as a great example of the power and the fun of research, because back when I was living in Washington, D.C., and attending Roy Branson's Sabbath school class there, he would put together these series, much like you do series here, and I happened to be teaching some art history classes out there, humanities classes, and he came up to me one day and said, "Hey, I want you to talk about, we're doing a series on the church councils. I want you to talk about the Second Council of Nicaea and the iconoclastic movement." And I think my face read, I didn't even know there was a Second Council of Nicaea. And what is iconoclastic? I mean, I knew nothing about this. But you don't say no to Roy Branson. And so I just got on the metro and went down to the Catholic University Library, which wasn't very far away, and started reading. And it was so interesting. I mean, these were the days before the internet was what it is today. So I had to go to the library and go down a rabbit hole. And so that's where I learned about this kind of fascinating moment. So this is where we want to be. So in 717, Leo III, you don't need to know anything about Leo III, becomes the Byzantine emperor following a successful defense of Constantinople against the Arab siege. Now, at this point in time, Constantinople being so close to the east, constantly being sort of fighting against the Islamic forces, right? So there's going to be a lot of sort of back and forth there. The soldiers on the battlefield are going to be familiar with the enemy. And it turns out, as those Christian soldiers discover, that those Islamic forces are keeping the second commandment. Because the Muslim tradition also does not do representational art, just like the Jewish tradition. So it seems like sort of a move of self-defense and politics that Leo suddenly thinks, I wonder if we keep losing because we're not keeping the second commandment, right? So there's a little bit of theology that starts going along there. And so in 726, he forbids the public display of icons and removes what apparently was a very prominent image of Christ from the chalk gate, sort of the main gate entrance to the city, and had it replaced by a simple cross. Now, crosses had not been a previous part of that early church movement as they were using Roman images because crosses weren't, highly favored as images at the time. But at this point, he just replaces the image of Christ with a cross. And again, as far as any scholars can tell, it might have had something to do with the tensions with Islam. In 741, his son takes the throne, and he intensifies the persecution against those who create or worship icons. And he begins to clarify the theological objections at that point as well. Before we get to those theological objections, here's just a reminder of what Islamic art looked like. Right? It's beautiful. It's not that they don't have art, but it's beautiful arabesques, it's design, it's calligraphy, right? I mean, their writing was art, but it is not representational images of animals, people, and certainly not of Muhammad, right? That is, even to this day, we hear still really, important news stories about when anybody tries to depict Muhammad in any way, especially a non-respectful way. Anyway, so to this church council. Now, this is not yet the Second Council of Nicaea. This is just a general council where they're trying to think about this. This happens in 754. And they say, "We decree unanimously in the name of the Holy Trinity that there shall be rejected and removed and cursed out of the Christian church every likeness which is made out of any material whatever by the evil art of painters." Gotta love it. "Anyone who presumes from now on to manufacture an icon or to worship it or set it up in a church or in a private house," they were serious about this, "or possess it in secret, he shall be deposed." And there certainly is record, as I previously mentioned, of lots of icons being destroyed during this period. There is some record of people dying, too. This was absolutely a time of persecution for those who used art, Christian art, in worship. All right, but our story continues. Obviously, it doesn't stop there. So in 755, Constantine's son becomes the emperor and kind of relaxes that prohibition against icons. And partly we know his wife Irene was keeping icons in secret. And the story does keep coming back to the women. They are the ones that kind of keep that tradition moving forward. He dies. When he dies, his wife serves as regent because his heir is only 9 years old, so she gets to take some power. She calls an ecumenical council to reverse the earlier iconoclastic rulings, but that meeting is disrupted by soldiers. Because remember, those soldiers are the ones who are dying on the battlefields and don't want to be dying for the wrong reasons, right? So the military stays very much against icons. So it's at this point that she calls the actual Second Council of Nicaea. And they are there to debate some really interesting questions. One is, can divinity be represented by humanity? All right? Can it ever be theologically okay to try to inscribe, to depict, to picture divinity? The second question they were very much needing to answer is, what does the second commandment really mean? Is it a command against art in general, right? Or is it just a command against creating statues of gods, false or otherwise? And then finally, is it okay to create an image of a divine figure as long as the purpose is not to worship that figure, right? So this is what they're talking about. So here is, and by the way, it's my understanding that the Pope back in Rome wasn't even invited to this council. That goes to show how little power he had at this particular point in time. He wasn't even there. So here is the practice of venerating icons is restored at this point. And here's their logic. The name Christ is indicative of both divinity and humanity, the two perfect natures of the Savior. Christians have been taught to portray this image in accordance with his visible nature, not according to the one in which he was invisible. For the latter is uncircumscribable, and we know from the gospel that no man hath seen God, right? So there's that logic. We haven't seen God, we can't draw him. These senseless people, the iconoclasts, say there is no distinction between the image and prototype and ascribe an identity of nature to entities that are of different natures. Who will not make fun of their ignorance? I love that that line is in the official record. These silly people cannot tell the difference between the nature of Christ that was human and the part of Christ which is divine. So that's what gives them permission to go back to utilizing icons in worship. So, again, it's not quite over yet. It's almost over, but not quite. In 813, Leo V seizes the throne once again, forbids the veneration of icons, and that poor image of Christ is taken down yet again from the Chalk Gate. Then and then 2 years later, he calls for a church council to reinstate the iconoclastic findings of the previous council. Right. And then in 829, Theophilus takes the throne, reinforces the iconoclastic policies, but here's the women again. His own wife, stepmother, and daughters are worshiping icons in secret. So when he dies, Theodora becomes regent, reestablishes the veneration of icons. And as far as I can tell, that's where the debate for this moment ends. As I mentioned before, and we're not going to go into all the details here tonight, there is certainly a split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. We may think of Roman Catholicism as using icons and images in worship, but those of you who have been to Byzantine churches know that this tradition of icons is much deeper in the Eastern Church. The Western Church sort of doing its own thing. So in 869, the Fourth Council of Constantinople, which is the final of the early church councils, formally reestablishes the veneration of images. We define with all accuracy and care that the venerable and holy icons be set up like the form and venerable and life-giving Christ, right? So talking about the fact that it's important to have painted representation so that those who behold them can be drawn into worship. I'm sort of paraphrasing now, but that's, and in thinking about the nature, again, of Christ. So, like I said, it's where we think this debate ends until the Protestant Reformation. And as you know, so we don't have to go into it here, in the Protestant Reformation, we go all iconoclastic again, but now for very, very different reasons. Now we're smashing up anything that smacks of Catholicism, and of course Catholicism is growing out of this tradition. So I'm only going to give you one quote from Martin Luther, just because, again, I think it's very interesting to hear his logic as it compares with some of this other. So this is in a tract against the heavenly prophets in the matter of images and sacraments, which, again, it's a debate that has been raging. He says, I approached the task of destroying images, because, again, the Protestant Reformation is running into trouble when it's running around smashing up people's churches and art that people loved. Right? It's not going to make you all that popular all the time. So there are some real radicals who are like, smash it up and burn it. And Martin Luther is like, if those images really don't have power, then why are we giving them power by running around and smashing them and making people mad? All right, so he says, I approach the task of destroying images by first tearing them out of the heart through God's word and making them worthless and despised. For when they are no longer in the heart, they can do no harm when seen with the eyes. But Dr. Karlstadt, this iconoclast, who pays no attention to matters of the heart, has reversed the order by removing them from sight and leaving them in the heart. Again, it's very, very interesting quote. So, but I think we all kind of have a sense of where Adventism is. I mean, if you look around your church and most of our churches, there's not a lot of representational art going on, right? We are a people of music, not necessarily a people of the visual arts, but we do have our own traditions. So just a few reminders. Yes, we depict the divine all over the place in our children's books. Harry Anderson, of course, being the most famous of them all. Some of you may remember this image. Jesus knocking on the door of the UN. I think, was it on Steps to Christ? Yeah, I remember that being in my house. As a child, I was so struck by this particular image. It's also interesting to note what our own Bible commentary says about the second commandment, right? I'm talking now about the green and gold one that we used to make tents out of or was that just me? The ones that I grew up with in my house. They're quoting Ellen White on the subject. A few, people condemned pictures, urging that they are prohibited by the second commandment. So clearly Ellen White and early Adventists are aware of this debate, and that everything of this kind should be destroyed. The second commandment prohibits image worship. So clearly that's her reading, right? That's what she's focusing on. But God himself employed pictures and symbols to represent to his prophets lessons which he would have them give to the people, and which could thus be better understood than if given in any other way. He appealed to the understanding through the sense of sight. So, interesting to hear her say that. In The Health Reformer, and then later also in Signs of the Times, she comes out directly advocating for the use of images, right? Because we're talking about publications, right? We're talking about evangelistic series. How do you have an evangelistic series without images, right? So she says, many may be reached best through sacred pictures illustrating scenes in the life and mission of Christ. By this means, truths may be vividly imprinted upon their minds, never to be effaced. So this is that same, essentially that use of icons. We can more powerfully be drawn into religious stories and experiences if our eyes are also stimulating. The Roman Catholic Church understands this fact. So she's acknowledging that Catholics, they understood the power, right? The appeal to the senses through sculpture and paintings. While we have no sympathy for image worship, to be clear about that, which is condemned by the law of God, we hold that it is proper to take advantage of that almost universal love of pictures in the young, to fasten in their minds valuable moral truths, to bind the gospel to their hearts by beautiful imagery illustrating the great moral principles of the Bible. So that's sort of her permission for how we skirt the second commandment. That finally, and again, this one mostly amuses me, because she also had to get into the business of defending or not defending images that sometimes she thought were just bad art. And that is a whole different question, right? So the question of taste was also at issue. Here in 1899, she says, should we not make investigation in regard to the matter of illustrating our books so largely, right? We're spending a lot of money and time on our illustrations. Would not the mind have clearer, more perfect ideas of angels, of Christ, of all spiritual things, if no pictures were made to represent heavenly things? Now, I don't necessarily see this as a contradiction, because here she's mostly talking about trying to depict things that our eyes have not seen, and she thinks we're getting a little fantastical in how we're using our imaginations. Many of the pictures made are grossly false as far as truth is concerned. We want to be true in all our representations of Jesus Christ. But many of the miserable daubs put into our books and papers are an imposition on the public. So she clearly had standards that were not always being met. But that brings us now. It brings us to just any conversation that you're interested in having about what role does art have in our religious experience? What role should it have? And I think, again, just a reminder that the debate about art is political. If you've ever sat on a church decorating committee, you might know that, right? It's political. It is theological, as we've discovered. And it's very personal. Some people are moved by art. Other people are left completely cold, right? So again, that was true then. I think it's true now. And it leaves wide open this question of the role of art in our religious experience. So that's officially where I'm ending the presentation, but I would be happy to entertain comments, questions, or even experiences that you might have, or knowledge that goes well beyond my own on this subject. Yeah. Oh, got a mic running around.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed it. This may be getting a little bit into the weeds, but when you were talking about Jews, I thought about the first temple and how they had the bowls and they had the angels on the ark. So I was wondering if it was a phenomenon of Second Temple Judaism?
Yeah, it's a great question because, and it absolutely should come up. That's only a couple of chapters down the line after this commandment, right? So it feels like, and again, I'm not an expert enough to be able to truly answer your question, but it certainly seems that temple art, which is definitely alive and well in Exodus and the Old Testament, by the time we get to later Judaism, it's true though that you don't see representational art later on. So I don't know when that transition happened, or whether it was just a distinct difference between what they felt they were being told to do in the temple. I just don't have a good answer to that question, but it's a good one, and I should dig for an answer.
I'll double dip. I think we're getting better at this now, but do you have any examples in history of where people didn't just insert the icons into their current culture? I guess the gold somewhat did that, but even their facial features or something were largely representative of the people painting them. And so I think now we're getting a bit better about trying to be accurate. But I was wondering, in history, has that always been, I know it's been the trend, but have there been any notable exceptions in art?
Well, art art is a huge question. Icons specifically, as they're modernized, remain very much the same. So not attempting any kind of, because that begins to be seen as a kind of idolatrous invasion of the artist. So the artist is supposed to remain completely out of it and just be depicting Christ through the tradition. So as you look at, even if you look at icons that are absolutely just done in the last 10 years, they're going to basically look the same. The materials might be different, but there's not going to be an individuality or an attempt at realism there. Whereas in other forms of art, including Christian art, that are not distinctly this form of icon, yeah, there's been all kinds of movements in that direction. Yeah.
Am I correct in assuming that this has caught your attention because you think it might be appropriate to have things like this, maybe in our sanctuary or in the foyer or whatever, because it speaks to certain kinds of people. May not speak to old, dim-witted, artistic Jay here, just go, but that it might speak to certain kinds of people and therefore have its own kind of ministry.
I like the way you put that. I can't claim that forethought, which I think is very, very interesting, because truly what my first engagement with this was absolutely academic, and I am not an artist. For many, many years, I was one of those people. I mean, I could get drugged through a museum and I'd be bored out of my mind because I hadn't studied art.
Your shirt is kind of artistic.
Oh, well, thank you. Appreciate that. I didn't start studying art until I was forced to start teaching it, interestingly enough, which is probably not good. But and of course, the more you know, the more you fall in love. I mean, that's just about any subject matter. But in this particular case, because I am not myself an artist, I'm not sure that that's what draws me necessarily into the vine. I've gotten better at it over the years, but I came at this very, very neutral in that sense. If we were talking about music, that would be a whole other conversation. I'm not so neutral about that. But in art, I find it sometimes utterly distracting, right? And visually assaulting and distracting from what's going on. And other times, truly moving, but the problem is, I think we're all moved by different things, right? So it's tricky business. Even just thinking about that particular sculpture, which, I can critique things about it, and I can also recognize that as a focal point on campus, where students like to gather, and where the church during the summer, when the students aren't there, gathers to do the foot washing, it becomes a beautiful focal point that adds a dimension to the experience that we could certainly live without. We wouldn't know if we were missing it, but it does add a beautiful dimension. So for me, it very much depends on the circumstances and the place. But I do agree with you, and I know so many students, and even one of my sisters, who are left absolutely cold by theology and literature, but resonate incredibly with art. So that's sort of Ellen White's view, that there's a real place for it because we are moved by our eyes and need to have that sense engaged. I don't know that answers your question, but yeah.
Growing up as a missionary's kid in Korea, and then going to Far Eastern Academy, I was exposed to a lot of books that we had, and I remember in my dad's library was Thoughts on the Mount of Blessings, Fu Manchu beard on Jesus,
Interesting.
and the ponytail in the back.
Yep.
It was really quite interesting, and it's all done in that painted black and white.
Yeah.
And it was just amazing to see. They're trying to be consistent with
Yeah.
what the people already understand.
Right, make the story culturally relatable through the visuals. Interesting, yeah.
The Egyptian icon had a dark-skinned Jesus. The other one you showed that
Yeah.
we see all the time
Yep.
with pale skin.
Yep.
Do you know where that one was created?
No, well, no. I mean, but they're basically all essentially a kind of Roman, right? I mean, I think it just kind of grows out of that Roman Western, right, context is probably why that happened. I'm just guessing.
It's
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that pale of skin was not common for that part of the world where it was
Right.
created. So I'm trying to...
Right, which is why it feels like that tradition starts a little bit closer west and then makes its way. That's a fantastic question. I just don't have a good answer. Yep, the blue eyes, the whole 9 yards. Yep. Good. Any other? Thanks.
This is a little bit tangential, but your presentation has been great focusing on this is a theological question. I remember when I was at Andrews, I had an architecture professor who took it added another layer to this. And he was adamant that any imagery, even if it's not of the divine, it's like that was in a Catholic church or Catholic context, for example,
Yeah.
the rosary window that you'll often see in stained glass,
Yep.
that was immoral to use. And I'm curious if you happen to know, when you've studied this, kind of what period did that come out of a certain era of Adventism, or did that predate Adventism?
That feels pretty Reformation. I mean, in other words, Adventist, to the degree that it's Adventist, it is more deeply growing out of the Protestant Reformation. Because that schism, right, that need to absolutely separate ourselves from Catholicism, again, I think it's telling of the power of art that that's the thing we started to smash, right? Even though Martin Luther says, well, that's a little silly, in terms of the symbolism, it mattered, right? And that was a pretty clear, easy way to make that distinction. And then pretty much all of the Protestant denominations, I mean, obviously there's scales. When you're talking about Anglican High Church, it's a little closer to using some of that imagery, but the deeper you get into Puritan Protestantism, I mean, that's like stark white, do not have any images at all. But then again, they also didn't have instrumental music. So it's growing out of that same be as non-Catholic as you can possibly be. So your professor is inheriting that from a long Protestant tradition. And again, from Ellen White's statements, I don't sense that in the early Adventist church. All right, but again, we've gone in many directions.
Don't mean to dominate. The interesting thing is that Ellen White herself, her and her husband, they had a picture of the whole, you've seen that picture, okay? Sinai's back here, the Ten Commandments, and
Yep.
Eden and all the rest.
Oh, yeah.
His body wasn't in cold before she had commissioned somebody to do it right. Beautiful, rather than, line drawings.
Interesting.
It was painted
Interesting.
in a very, very nice artistic way.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
The other thing is, I expected our architect over here to break in. There's several churches in our denomination that take architectural things very seriously.
Absolutely.
And it's amazing. I took some classes at the Mennonite Seminary in Eau Claire, and the building was beautiful, even though they're not supposed to have images.
Yeah.
The stone like that went around, and the stained glass window could always be reflected on the brick. But it was beautifully done. Anyway.
Again, just that I think godly, human embedded response to beauty, right? And that being a form of beauty just doesn't happen to be representational, but that's clearly part of why we also respond to art. Yeah, we didn't even get into architecture. At the same time that these debates are raging, of course, the churches are stunning. The mosaic work is gorgeous, right? Lots of money is going into it. This debate just happens to be about whether or not to depict Christ.
Most of your presentation here regarding the decisions about iconography and so forth is all, you've referenced the Byzantine Church and the Eastern and so on and so forth. And maybe this is an indication of my lack of church history here. But, and some of these decisions are clear out 700 and so forth.
Yep.
And maybe this is presentation to come, but what was this not a discussion over in the Western with Rome and generally most of us, when we think of early Christianity, that's where we think. We don't think too much about the Eastern Orthodox and Constantine and so forth. So, was anything going on with this at all in the West?
Well, things are certainly, I mean, it's always going on and evolving. But the emphasis here on the East is in part because that is the center of power for the Christian church and for the Christian empire at this moment in time. And again, it's where these church councils are happening. They are happening in the East. Again, that's that center of power. Now, obviously, that is going to shift, and again, I'm not the historian, and I don't want to pretend to have all the details about that. And that begins to shift once we get past this moment. 7th and 8th councils, and then there's kind of that schism between the East and the West, and we begin to focus our attention in church history much more on the West again. I don't have all the details of because they're not having the public formal conversations about it in the West in this moment. The formal councils are happening in the East, and so those are the conversations that are documented. So the fact that we just don't have as much of the documentation from the conversations in the West. But what I do know from my reading is that the West in Rome, even though they're the ones that started with the tradition of actually, I don't even think I mentioned this, of before Christianity, the Roman Empire would ascribe certain powers to the sculptures of their emperors. For example, we read tales, I don't know how true they are, that you could actually send a sculpture of a Roman emperor sort of in his place, right, to sit in judgment if he couldn't be everywhere at once. And so it had certain powers, propaganda imagery had certain powers. But as far as I know, the Western Church never got into icons in terms of ascribing the same power to them. That is something that's much more an Eastern tradition. So even though certainly we have all of the iconography of Mary, certainly in the West, and it seems more dominant in the West, all the images of Mary, all of that stuff, the icon as described here just didn't have the same hold. It doesn't seem like. So that's why, again, you will see icons in Roman Catholic churches in the West, but not in the same kind of number and dominance that you see them in an Eastern Orthodox church. So I don't have a great answer to your question. It's a good observation.
This is really far off from what we're talking about. But
Great fun.
I thought of this the other day about having engraven images, and I think of all the photos that we have of us all over our houses, and wouldn't put up an ugly picture. We want the best picture that we have.
Right.
And it's kind of like we're making a graven image into ourselves. And I don't know, it just crossed my mind the other day, and I don't know. But I know we have lots of graven images in our house and books and
That is
photo books, and not so much anymore. They're on our phones, or computers. But
right. But I love that observation. It is so true. We are fixated on images. But as you're pointing out, they're images of us. And the whole idea of us photoshopping ourselves and how we're presenting ourselves and how that relates to the second commandment, that's a great observation.
You know, to illustrate, well, how art and color can I don't know, create a focus in a person or something, an identity. I was teaching a class, and it was a religion class. A class I didn't have any business teaching, but that's why I was teaching it. And one day I wore a shirt that was a kind of a white shirt, and it had some fine white, or not white, but red and blue and green stripes on it. And it was given to me, and there was this green tie, a rather green, bright green tie. And I remember there was a young lady that came up to me after class, and I don't know, somehow I guess I just got the impression she was there in class, but wasn't necessarily attracted to the class.
Right.
And she came up, and it was obviously, she complimented me on my tie and my shirt, and it was obvious that was something that she identified with. And I think, probably a little imaginary here, but I think she became more interested in the class because of that. So that follows along this line of some things speak to people, art, etc., and so on. So anyway, enough of that.
And certainly church architecture has done much to draw people into spiritual spaces because of the aesthetic, for sure.
I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll frame this as an observation that your presentation triggered, and
Good.
feel free to comment on it if you want. It seems like in our evangelistic series, we have not done a fair job of presenting this whole second commandment in the Catholic Church conversation to the point where across Adventism, like we don't have this conversation that it was even a debate between them. It was just, they brought idols into the church, they brought pagan gods and renamed them, and they, Peter and different ones. And to the point where, like the conversation you brought up about replacing the image of Christ with a cross, many of our churches won't even allow a cross because we've gone to such an extreme in the way we've presented this subject. We may have done harm to ourselves in being able to carry forward, even like what Ellen White advised, with images to capture people's imagination and present the story.
Very interesting point. And again, part of the problem is the subjectivity of the subjectivity, again, of what some people prefer visually, which then can get leveraged as theology, which then turns into politics, and then you're right back to fighting over it again. So, yeah, these are great observations. I think we're probably getting close to being out of time.
Yeah, I have a couple observations, and then I want to give it back to you as the teacher, and you can make closing remarks, and I can close with a quick prayer.
Okay.
A couple things that jumped out at me. I really feel God is an artist.
Yeah.
That's what creation is all about.
Absolutely.
The idea that he created spaces, he started with broad brush strokes, and then he, filled in the details. The other thing, I had an epiphany somewhere along the way. I love this Ellen White quote that basically says, when the image of God is fully reproduced in his people, he'll come back.
Yeah.
I was reading, I can't remember why, but I was reading through the chapter in Great Controversy on the sanctuary, and there's a comment that she made in there that Christ is in his sanctuary building his church. And I had the picture, I put those two together with the idea that God is taking each one of us as images or little puzzle pieces or as icons, and he's building a picture, and he basically is there telling his dad, I'm almost done, and when I'm done, we can go back and get them, and it looks just like you. So in a way, God is building a self-portrait of himself through us.
Wow.
Anyway,
That is
whatever that's worth.
That is a great image. And probably the image that we should that we can leave with. I'll just say that we're switching gears tomorrow. I mean, each one of the presentations is about depictions of the divine, but they are coming from very different places and perspectives. So tomorrow morning we will start out with some Milton and Ellen White, and we will then be moving into do some Rembrandt and other things during church, and then finally we'll get to sci-fi and AI in the afternoon. So there we go.
Quick prayer, and we can go our different ways. Father God, thanks so much for just being the awesome God that you are, and we just